I'm going to start off the readings, and one of the selections that I included that I have for the book, I wrote for the book, is entitled Prose. The invention of prose rendered poetry obsolescent. Poetry can best be understood as the absence of the prosaic. In the absence of the prosaic, we can clearly perceive that we live in an enchanted world. Poetry is the chant, the spell, the glamour that transforms the world, that makes magic from the mundane. In the presence of the poetic, we can discern the spiritual and divine dimensions of creation. Poetry is sacred, prose is profane. A poetic curse is an affliction. A prosaic curse is profanity. Poetry elevates discourse. Prose forces language to the ground, making it prostrate. The opposite of prose is amateurs. And the word amateur means lover. The creation of prose is said to be the world's oldest profession. The creation of prose is called prostitution. The composition of poetry is love-making. Poetry is love made manifest, love given substance and form. Poetry finds its home in the human heart. Poetry is therefore easy to learn by heart, while prose is easily forgotten. Poetry lives in the heart of all humanity as our common inheritance. Everyone is born a poet, singing our first song at the moment of birth, moving on to the pure poetry of infantile babbling and baby talk, and entering a sing-song world of nursery rhymes and lullabies. As we grow older, we are weaned away from poetry and force-fed the solid food of prose. Before prose can take command, poetry must be cut off. We do not give up on poetry all that easily, so it must be surgically removed. Once poetry is amputated, prose can take its place as a prosthetic. Prose must wage war on poetry, invade and attack poetry in order to take control over its territory. Prose is the adversary of poetry, seeking to capture, contain, and incarcerate poetry in an offensive that is called prosecution. Prose has its zealots who, with religious conviction, mount a campaign for conversion from poetry by word and by sword. This process is called proselytizing. Before the invention of prose, we had no choice but to remain poetic. Poetry was as ubiquitous, as invisible, as inevitable, and as essential as the air we breathe. We did not even understand or recognize poetry itself because there was nothing to compare it to. Poetry was all there was. Before the invention of prose, poetry was our invisible environment. We lived in poetry. We worked and played in poetry. We ate and drank in poetry. We fought and fucked in poetry. We prayed and entertained in poetry. We spoke, sang, danced, drew, and decorated in poetry. We thought, dreamed, and remembered in poetry. Poetry is the first speech of our species, our primal tongue. Prose is our second language, a poor translation of the original utterance. Poetry is the language of languages, or meta-language. Poetry is the form of forms, or metamorphosis. Few recognize the return of poetry in the form of advertising slogans and jingles, popular songs heard on the radio and recordings, theme music for TV programs, and within online communities of bloggers. The revival of poetry was made possible by the advent of the electronic media environment, which retrieved tribal wisdom and village life on a global scale. The retrieval of poetry by the electronic media renders prose obsolescent. The recovery of poetry is, in fact, the recovery of humanity following an extended period of convalescence. Hanks. That was actually in abridged form. The full version you have to buy the book for.